I wanted to share a couple of verses from a master that I've been contemplating the last month, having discovered this book this winter by the monk Matthew Ricard. He did some translations. Most of these I don't think have been in English before. And he just compiled this book of kind of like quotes from great masters that he really liked, and he arranged them pretty much like in a lamrim order and such. And it's called On the Path to Enlightenment, Hard Advice from the Great Tibetan Masters. And I just discovered this one. It's kind of like a glance meditation in a way. It might be mostly, I don't really know because I haven't thought about it in this way till today. Maybe it's mostly about the first and second scope primarily, but I think it actually has parts from all the three scopes in it. And it's by Jamyang Kongtrul Lodro Te. And he was a great master who was born in Tibet in 1813 and lived till almost 1900. And he was born in eastern Tibet into a Bon family. But he received a Buddhist education and became a Buddhist. And he showed some extraordinary capacities at an early age. He ended up being a very open-minded individual. He studied with masters from all the schools. He spent his whole life, and so he was able to, because he was so bright also, and I don't know, I think he must have been a reincarnation, really. He was able to take in the topics and study deeply. He studied medicine, all kinds of things. And so he was able to master the Buddhist teachings. And he spent his whole life writing, meditating, and teaching. And he was apparently, it sounds like, must have been a very humble person, because even though he had a great rank, he refused to accept any servants, which was not the custom of his time. He and another great master, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, were the two people that developed the Rimé movement in Tibet. And he wrote what is kind of considered like almost an encyclopedia of the Buddhist teachings. It's like 90 volumes. We have a number of them in our library. We were gifted this series. It's about 10 books set into about 8 actual books. But anyway, he was very prolific, and he had taken the time to really learn the various teachings. That isn't really what drew me to him, I have to say. It was what he wrote. I just found it so useful to contemplate, like how we contemplate the verses of Shantideva. They open your mind to think about things in a different way, and very poetically written, which is actually quite nice too. So it's a number of pages long. I'm just going to read I think maybe 5 or 6 verses from what he wrote before he was well known. At that point, he was living in solitude in the mountains. He was an aspiring hermit. He didn't have his fancy name title yet. He just had his born name of Yongten Gamso. And he wrote himself this aspirational prayer to admonish himself and to invoke the compassion of the wisdom deities. So I'll read the first verse, which kind of sets the opening, and then I go more to the middle of the text for 5 verses, and then I'll just talk about one or two of them. But just to give you a flavor of it, I'll read this. First verse is, Masters of the oral tradition, victorious Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, powerful Avalokiteshvara and precious Tara, hold with your compassion one who, forgetting death, thinks only of the business of this life, squandering his freedoms and favorable conditions. So this is how he starts his text. And he has a lot of great verses about impermanence and such. I'm going to start with this set of 5 verses, I think, or 5 or 6 that had 2 verses that I really have stayed with. And it starts with this. This alternation of joys and sufferings is like the cycle of the seasons. Without realizing that, how could I get tired of cyclic existence? With the certainty that suffering will again be my lot, may I sincerely practice the supreme Dharma. Like a stone in water, one sinks to the bottom of samsara. Now, if I do not seize the rope of compassion that the three jewels offer me, later it will become impossible. May I sincerely practice the Supreme Dharma. The qualities of liberation are as precious as an island of jewels. Without knowing them, there's no way to arouse one's courage. Recognizing the unassailable gains of the conquerors, may I sincerely practice the Supreme Dharma. The life stories of enlightened beings are like ambrosia. Without reading them, one cannot develop faith. Knowing where lies victory or defeat, and no longer buying my own suffering, may I sincerely practice the Supreme Dharma. You like that? Buying my own suffering. Altruistic aspiration to enlightenment is like a fertile field. If one does not develop it, there's no way to attain Buddhahood. Without abandoning through indifference the accomplishment of the noble goal, may I sincerely practice the Supreme Dharma. So maybe I'll start with this last verse. What really spoke to me here was when he was helping us to see, why might you abandon bodhicitta? It might be through indifference. And for those of us for me, indifference is something that I am quite aware of when it comes up in my mind. To me, it's the mind that goes, whatever. Like, I can't be bothered. I'm not going to involve myself. And I've thought about that some, and, this just kind of gives you a little wake-up call. Without abandoning through indifference, you're going to just let go of these vast, beautiful goal of bodhicitta. Because why? Because your mind goes to indifference. And when I contemplate this and look at my mind, I realize lately, I remember I said to Venerable Chodron in the last couple months ago, I don't have the capacity. And her reply was, you just don't know what to do. This is essentially what it meant, what she told me. And I realized that that's the mind that feels like it doesn't have the capacity, doesn't know how to handle something, essentially. That mind can easily go to indifference, because you don't want to spend your life being in aversion, so you just go to indifference instead, and let's just dig a little hole and stick our head in it, and like an ostrich, and not bother, right? So I think that's been a good reflection for me, to then look at situations where I see any indifference come up in my mind and try to recognize, well, where is that coming from? And, I do think the thing of like, what I was thinking of capacity comes up, but I think it's actually been really helpful for me to challenge that and think, well, what is it? Okay, maybe I don't know what needs to be done. But for me, what I always go back to then is the big lesson I've learned in coming here is there's always something to be done. Like when you're in like situations with people that you can't fix, right? You can't fix them. Right? And I think my mind always goes back to the way the Venerable Chodron taught the Four Immeasurables way back years ago in Newport at Create. It must have been 2007. She explained the Four Immeasurables, and the one about equanimity was, you just realize when there's nothing to be done in a situation, and then you keep your mind equanimous so that when the conditions change, you'll be open, you'll be able to. But if you just go to indifference or shut down, then when the conditions change and maybe somebody you're trying to help, they're ripe, they're ready, it's a teachable moment, where are you going to be? You're going to be sitting off indifferent or, not involved anymore. So that's, I think, one lesson that this reminded me of. The one that really got me, though, was this one about the seasons. This alternation of joys and sufferings is like the cycle of the seasons. This alternation of joys and suffering is like the cycle of the seasons. That's not how I think about it. And this metaphor just like woke up to me like I know this isn't the way I think about it, but it's so apt. It's so natural. It's just so natural, like the seasons, that we have joy and suffering, and we're always going back and forth and back and forth. And my mind always has expectations and hopes and fears and everything coming up because I have a different expectation. I have a different view of how things are supposed to be. I don't see it that way. I grew up thinking, being raised in a way that like happiness was kind of like a given, and the moments that weren't happy were like the problems. But happiness was the given. It was like what is that expression we have for when you are you feel like you're entitled. You know, it's just like a feeling of entitlement almost. Yeah, I think that's how I held things. I'm just entitled. The world is supposed to be this way. It was my view. Like, yeah, the world, life is good, and if it's not good, the problem is somewhere else, right? But no, this isn't what the Buddha taught when he taught the Four Noble Truths. So it's the nature of our existence in samsara that will have this fluctuation, just like the seasons of joy and suffering. And if we don't realize that, how are we ever going to get tired of this? That's the second line. If we don't, if we're bought into our first view, we'll never actually give up on cyclic existence. We'll just keep trying to line things up more pleasantly. We'll keep just, what I did for many years is just keep changing, Don't eat 5 cupcakes, just eat 3.5, and then go on to Coca-Cola, and then go for a walk, and then play your guitar, and then do this. But don't do anything too long. Everything in moderation was exactly what I was taught. This was, in my household, this was the big thing. Everything in moderation. Well, that works pretty well if you want to just kind of go along with the flow in this way and never get out of this situation. Never look, never see. So if you think of this more as like the seasons, this is our body and mind under the control of ignorance and karma and our afflictions. It's just natural. And knowing that there's a cause, we can do something about this. So yeah, it's like the seasons, but even with that, it's not saying that there's no solution. It's actually just a wake-up verse. Like, with the certainty that suffering will again be my lot, may I sincerely practice the supreme Dharma. So, enjoy.